Presentation today is by Rebecca Parker from Swinburne University of Technology. Rebecca graduated from Curtin with a Masters of Information Management in 2007. She's currently the Research Services Librarian at Swinburne University of Technology. She's managed Swinburne's institutional repository since 2008 and more recently has been involved in the planning Swinburne support for research data management, supporting online publishing and developing the content for the researcher profile pages. Rebecca is keen to ensure that academic library services are tailored not just to the needs of students but also to researchers and corporate areas of universities. And Rebecca will be talking to you today about lessons from data sharing for institutional repositories.
Thank you. I've got the very admirable after lunch slot, so I may get you up and dance at some point. I'm just going to try something out. Okay, I don't know if you've seen on the conference website, there's a little button to fill out a poll. I've got a couple up there at the moment. I'd love you to answer them. I haven't got many responses yet, so feel free to respond during the session and I'll be amazed at the end of the session if there are some more up there. So the questions I've asked are, what do you believe is the greatest barrier to data deposit? What do you believe would provide the strongest incentive for data deposit? And when data is contributed to a data service at your institution, who creates the metadata? So they're questions that are kind of related to today's presentation. Today's presentation is about what we learned from the institutional repositories movement and how much of that is actually quite applicable to the data sharing movement. There are some commonalities and some differences. At Swinburne, our approach from the beginning has been to tie our data services as closely as possible to our institutional repository, and we've got a few lessons for you from that. I should acknowledge that most of the thinking around this presentation happened under the auspices of our ANZ Seeding the Commons project, so thank you to ANZ for that funding. I think most of us, as part of our ANZ funding, would have had to describe a certain number of data sets for Research Data Australia. That's certainly what we did as part of our project. That's a real information management problem, how to store, describe, manage, provide access to and display content. Which is, a common problem for publications in institutional repositories as well. But one thing that I've found from talking to other people who've done Seeding the Commons projects is that none of us seems to have had a particularly easy time finding the data sets for our project. And that seems to be applicable across the board. For people who needed to find lots of data sets or not very many, that they didn't just jump out of nowhere. There may be a data deluge, but there's not an overwhelming data demand, at least at my institution. So it seems to me we've got a content recruitment problem, which is familiar to any of you who've worked in institutional repositories for publications before. Sorry. One of the things that struck me about the introduction to this conference is that we had an introduction from the government, an introduction from a university, but no introduction from a researcher. The reasons that researchers are asked to share their data are, firstly, the government driver. That's no surprise to anyone. Andrew Cheetham yesterday gave some great reasons for why you'd want to, such as science and social questions being more global in focus than they were. But it seems that the government's motivations are more around transparency and accountability for public investment in research. And that's no surprise. For institutions, the driver to share data, there are a few. It improves our own record keeping for what we've got, our research assets. It makes sure that we exploit our research assets to our best of our ability, and it allows us to showcase the best of the research that's happening in our institutions. But it's the researchers who will or will not share the data, and at the moment I think their needs and wants are a little bit out of the picture. I did say I might get you up to dance, and the only dance I can think of is the time warp here, so jump to the left and a step to the right. For anyone who worked in publications before they worked in data, like I did, This diagram that I just showed for data is almost exactly the same as how we dealt with publications. So the government was again looking at transparency and accountability and public knowledge. Institutions were interested in showcasing their research publications, but researchers were the invisible people at the bottom of the chain. And I think we've been able to emphasise some very tangible benefits for sharing publications openly. That's not a problem. But I feel like the journey for data is going to be a lot harder. Realistically, data sharing isn't easy. There are quite a lot of barriers for researchers to contributing, and you would think they would need to be outweighed by the benefits of sharing, the old carrot and stick metaphor. This really hasn't happened yet, and sort of researchers are a little bit like the rest of us. There needs to be a reason why they would go the extra mile, such as reward or recognition, and at the moment I don't feel like there is. So my co-authors and I identified 5 problems facing data curation today, and for those of us who worked with publications, they're fairly familiar issues as well. Many of them are exactly the same, and we found some solutions to them, some workarounds, but not all of the solutions are going to work for data. I'm happy to walk you through the ones that will though. So the 5 issues we noticed were incentives or lack thereof, the difficulty of contribution, the dangers of contribution, rightly or wrongly, the researcher's perception of that, demands on researchers, or demands institutionally and governmentally, and existing data sharers. This cake shop, for anyone who doesn't know, is in Ackland Street, and you should definitely duck down there and visit it. Those frogs in the middle were my favourite when I was little. To us, there seems to be a lack of incentive, despite the apparent citation advantage to sharing data. The code for I never get this right. The Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research unfortunately expresses the need to share data as justifying the outcomes and defending them if they are challenged. And that's possibly the worst possible reason to give a researcher to share their data. They already work in a climate where they feel like they're judged all the time. Every single research assessment exercise gets a little bit more probing. And the idea that this becomes part of their process every day is a concern for me. With processes like HERDC and ERA, with all the problems that come with them, they are a burden, but it's a quantifiable one for researchers because there's a direct correlation between the effort they put into the collection and the research funding that comes back to them. So they might wonder why they would contribute data to a repository that's time that could be spent on preparing a publication for which they will get credit. There's a movement to prepare a data citation standard that would allow people who are depositing their data freely to be able to have that data cited and acknowledged more widely. But at the moment, without ready take-up of that, there'll be no way of counting those references. The next one is difficulty. And at the beginning of the publications repository process, there were a lot of usability studies that indicated that it wasn't quite as straightforward to deposit as we might have thought it would be. A lot of researchers saw it as an administrative burden, and why would they do that when this data is already available, they've already contributed for other reasons. For Swinburne, our choice was to run what's called mediated deposit. So we actually do all of the work in the library for the researchers. We catalogue the records, we do the copyright and permissions sorting. And for us, that reaped benefits. For our researchers, there was a sense that we took the institutional out of the repository and replaced it with something more personal and concrete and useful. Unfortunately, you'd think that with the fewer tangible benefits of sharing data, that the process for data deposit would be easier than for publications, but it's not. The bar is very high for creating good quality metadata for data. And Swinburne, following our institutional repository method, the librarians during the pilot for our ANZ data project, we tried describing the data ourselves, and it really doesn't work. As much as I wanted to, I couldn't do it. There were too many holes in my knowledge, and not just subject expertise, but understanding of who owned the data, what license it was available under, whether it had been published before. All of that kind of metadata for publications is more or less public domain. There's really more or less only one answer. It was published in X journal with X ISSN. You know, that's quite straightforward. But for data, two different people could catalogue a data set completely differently, and they do. Third issue is danger. I could have put Will Robinson up there, but I like the Daleks better. For researchers, there, for better or worse, is a terrible fear of danger to their reputation in sharing their data. And in a climate of assessment, they don't want to put anything out there that might bounce back on them at some point in the future. We've got a few ways of getting around that. If we show that our metadata is good, if we have good provenance in our metadata, that's one way around it. Researchers with publications were quite fearful that they might be breaching their contracts with publishers whenever they deposited their publications. That's not completely ruled out by data. There are still some ownership and licensing issues around that. For researchers who want to share their data, there's a risk of breaching the privacy of their participants. And for them, the idea of a participant and their future life and how it might be affected by their data being available is a more concrete concern than the faceless funding body that tells them that they need to share their data. Ethics is one thing. With data sharing, that seems to be quite new. With publications, there wasn't much of a risk of ethical problems. I mean, if it was that commercial in confidence, it probably didn't get published in the first place. But with data, there is still that inherent problem of releasing information that couldn't be released. Researchers are worried that those who access the data through an open repository might be ill-equipped to understand it, and that their data might not be treated with respect, especially by those outside the discipline. And that's an issue we still have to grapple with a bit. Mandates are really quite common for institutional repositories around the world. It's kind of the stock standard way of doing things. You mandate that researchers deposit their publications. They don't guarantee 100% compliance, however. And with a mandated deposit for publications, there is, of course, this concrete sense of reward for publications deposit, but that structure is missing with data deposit. Until there's any kind of connection between sharing your data and having it contributed to your research assessment, there's no reason why anyone would do it. There's a sense that data sharing might be a collegial tradition, but that's only when the terms and the nature of the sharing are determined by the researcher. So that old practice of emailing someone your data because they asked for it, there's a sense of control on the part of the researcher for who's looking at it and how. When data is in an open repository, the terms and the nature of the sharing are dictated by a third party, and that's a concern for researchers. One of the few demands that I did like to use in the past was that the ARC Discovery Project wording talked about how within 6 months of the end of the project you needed to share your data, preferably in an institutional repository, unless there was a really good reason for not doing so. And unfortunately, between 2011 and 2012, there was a little bit of a shift in that wording. It became a bit more, maybe, sort of, if you feel like it this week, next week, maybe. So unfortunately, we lost that stick. Or as my colleague says, the stick has been well and truly whittled down. It might be really hard to see why existing disciplinary data sharers could be a problem. However, the institutional repositories movement for publication indicated to us that the people we thought were the best targets, the people who were already sharing, were not necessarily the best champions of an institutional repository. They already had a subject-based practice of sharing, and they didn't like the idea that an institutional system would get in their way. It's an extra workload for them, especially if we're asking them to catalogue it in a different way from how it appears in their subject repository. Nevertheless, it's a good idea not to alienate the people who are already on your side. These sharers may have already negotiated some of those other steps, like the dangers and the difficulties, but it doesn't make them good candidates for sharing. So from here, we've looked at these issues and what we can do around them. Data citation standards and working on that may be one way to address some of these problems. The danger issue, I don't think we've solved yet, and the institutional repository movement isn't going to help with that either. But I don't think we can penalise institutions or researchers who aren't actually sharing right now when the barriers to sharing are so high. So the problem that we're left with is how to make data sharing as seamless as possible so we no longer have to worry about the barriers and can start promoting the benefits. Thank you. Leonie. Absolutely. If someone demands that we do, yeah. I'm in a slightly awkward position. It's kind of an on-demand service for us at the moment if we describe someone's data. If a whole centre came to me with, you know, an external hard drive and said, here you go, I don't know what I'd do. We'd be quite lost, yeah. Les?
Well, of course you're not going to stop doing it. You've had 10 years of experience of banging your head against the wall. Why would you stop now? But it seems to me that, you know, sort of what's going on at the moment is we're putting in the infrastructure for people to take, you know, for a new generation of e-researchers to take advantage of, you know, sort of as they gradually start to appear, as attitudes change, as, you know, sort of kind of social relationships with researchers change, as you know, our professional ideas change. Do you think that you know, you're going to be doing this for a long time before, you know, that sort of thing starts, before everything comes up to meet you, or do you think that, you know, sort of, with the, you know, the funding that's been available in Australia, you know, and the attention on e-research, do you see that it's, you know, it's going to come a bit quicker?
I'd like to think so, but I think we need a little bit more help with this one. I mean, with the publications, it was pretty easy to sell to people, really. I mean, you get a public profile for what you're doing, your research is out there. And I've found with early career researchers, data is quite an easy sell as well. If you just tell them that their research profile is out there and they need to do everything they can to share it, they're a good group to join. And maybe that is the problem. Maybe we do just need to wait a little longer. But I'm a bit impatient, as you can tell. Anyone else? Right.